Why are they saying Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is bringing back vampires? Vampires never went away. The real ones already knew that.
This arguably is personal because I've been working on this film for 10 years or more.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Usually when I do a review of a new theatrical release, I begin with a spoiler-free section and then I do a spoiler section. But I couldn't quite gauge what constitutes spoilers for this one because you've got Bram Stoker's Dracula book released in 1897, as well as the original Nosferatu film released in 1922. However, not everyone reads or watches source material, so for this review I'm first going to share an extremely broad, general snippet of feedback for people who just want an idea of how I rate this new film without going into many specifics. Then I will move into discussions of the source material, where I will try not to give away some of the bigger dramatic reveals that are specific to this new adaptation, but talking about the source material will involve some plot spoilers, so if that's going to bother you, sorry that you didn't know the details of a story or even an interpretation of a story, both of which are over 100 years old. Finally, the last section will be going into full spoilers. In a general sense, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is excellent. I had some nitpicks that I won't go into just yet. I will wait until we get into the final spoiler section. But when I take all the moving parts of my feedback into consideration, ultimately I landed on a 4.3 out of 5. If you have any sort of hype or anticipation for this film, I will predict that you will enjoy this. Robert Eggers' direction is truly excellent. I love the way the shots have been designed, the way that the camera moves through the space of a scene, and also his shadow work is impeccable. If you've seen the trailer, you will have probably observed footage of the shadow of a clawed hand moving over the German city where a sufficient amount of the story takes place. That visual is just the tip of the iceberg of what Robert Eggers does with darkness and shadow work in his Nosferatu. It's so visually exquisite and artistically designed, but it also has a significant role in the story. What he's doing is not just something that is cool to look at, although that would have been more than good enough of a reason for me, but what it does is it makes the darkness feel like something tangible. Instead of darkness merely being the absence of light, it feels like something that could in fact reach out and snatch you up. It feels like an extension of this predatory monster. So much of how this film looks is worthy of praise. Shooting on location, the sets, the production design, the costumes, all of it makes the world feel so much more real and lived in. A lot of blockbuster franchise films feel like they're flimsy and hollow because they rely too much on rushed VFX work by overworked, underpaid VFX artists, and that causes a separation between the story and the viewer where, even if it's happening subconsciously, the viewer is not fully immersing themselves in the world and the truth of whatever that narrative is. But more often than not, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu transports you to this centuries-old, supernatural, gothic place. I don't want to say that it feels particularly German, not just because the characters are speaking English, but because you've mostly got British people using British accents and one person doing an unconvincing British accent, and nothing about how the characters come across felt particularly German to me. Just because you're saying Herr instead of Mr. or Lord, that doesn't automatically make me feel as though you're coming across German. I actually would have preferred if more of the British actors had made some alterations to their accents in order to differentiate themselves in such a way where it would come across as something different from just being another British period piece. That's not a nitpick I think will be an issue for general moviegoers, but nonetheless, it's how I felt about things. When I compare it to something like Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, where you had multiple American actors playing French men in the Middle Ages, the way that they changed the pronunciation of their words, it ultimately helped me to better believe that I was in fact watching a story in the 1300s.
Carouge will be furious.
Too true. Now take your fucking pants off.
I mostly really enjoyed Bill's performance as Nosferatu, although I did have one gripe, but that will be shared in the spoiler section. He's more than made it clear that he loves to dig into these dark, grimy stories and creatures. I've said before that he reminds me of that one Willem Dafoe sentiment about wanting to be a creature for the directors he works with, and that made it feel all the more poetic that both he and Willem Dafoe are in this film. And actually, they give two of the better performances out of this ensemble. I really appreciate how Robert Eggers leans into more of of the horror of the Dracula/Nosferatu story. Over time, the story and the titular character have become somewhat romanticized, but that's really not how they began. Nosferatu was my final highly anticipated film for 2024. I knew I needed to see it before I could finalize my top 10 for the year, and then that will be the video that I post next. I had high standards going into watching it because I really enjoyed The Northman. Now that I've seen this, I do have to say that The Northman is still my favorite Robert Eggers film. However, Nosferatu still lived up to many of the high standards I had as far as visual flair, style, and drama that I would expect to see from Robert Eggers. Now, did it make it into the top 10 of my year? Well, you're just going to have to stick around to find out.
It required writing a rich backstory for Orlok and a very rich backstory for Ellen.
Now I want to talk about source material and some bits of how that relates to there being a new Nosferatu film. In going back and reading Dracula, one of the most striking differences in how he is presented compared to how audiences often experience him in the film medium today is that they don't ever show Dracula's point of view. The story is told through various journal entries and other written documentation that comes from any number of human characters, and what that does is it keeps you entrenched in the psychological, emotional state of having to cope with encountering and being hunted by this terrifying monster. I also feel like depending on which version of Dracula you're seeing, he can tend to foray into the territory of being considered attractive by the audience. In the book, though, he is only ever a monster. Two standout parts of the book that really creeped me out and unsettled me were when Jonathan is being held captive in Dracula's castle and he goes snooping during the day and he discovers Dracula's coffin. The way that that encounter plays out really upset me because of how effective it was as horror storytelling. And the other part was when he is preying on Lucy, that's Mina's friend. The way that Dracula is just relentlessly preying on her and these humans in her life, they keep trying to intervene, but any improvement they're able to make for her health ends up being all for naught because he keeps coming back, he keeps feeding on her, and all of that really cemented my understanding of this being the origin of his character as a true monster. Nosferatu was a German film adaptation of Dracula released in 1922, but it was made without permission from the original rights holders, so the people involved were sued into oblivion. Putting aside the fact that this film is now regarded as a classic and foundational to the horror genre in film, there's something off-putting to me about the arrogance of how they went about trying to adapt the book without permission, as if they weren't going to get in trouble. I'm not going to tell you every minute detail of the alterations between the two stories, but I will provide a bit of an overview. The core group of human characters in Dracula are in England, but in Nosferatu, they're in Germany. Certain character names have been changed. Dracula, or Count Dracula, is now referred to as Nosferatu or Count Orlok. The man who goes to Dracula's castle and is held captive for a while, Jonathan, his name is changed to Thomas, and his fiancée and eventual wife Mina is now named Ellen. Dracula in the book is very powerful, his abilities are vast, but the pop cultural perception of his supernatural powers and weaknesses, because of numerous film adaptations that we've seen, are more so consolidated compared to the book. The Nosferatu film was part of shaping that perception. One example of this is that in the book, Dracula can be up and active during the day, but in a weaker state. He is stronger at night and he doesn't have access to all of his many powers during the day. Nosferatu needs to stay in his coffin during the day because if he is exposed to sunlight, he will die. But another key difference between the original Dracula and Nosferatu is the ending. Irish author Bram Stoker opted for a more romantic ending where Jonathan and Mina survive the ordeal of Dracula preying on Mina and her almost being turned into a vampire. Team Human is able to successfully hunt down Dracula and kill him. They save Mina and presumably generations that may very well have become yet another victim of this monster. The final bit of the book is a note written by Jonathan 7 years after they killed Dracula, where it is revealed that Jonathan and Mina now have a son named Quincy, who was named after one of their friends that was part of that group that hunted down Dracula, but unfortunately died from wounds that he sustained in that final battle to get to Dracula's body in his coffin. In Nosferatu, Ellen learns from a book that Nosferatu can be killed if a pure-hearted woman distracts him long enough. If she offers up her blood willingly, he will be so swept up in her beauty and blood that he will feed on her and just forget his most basic survival instincts, so the sun will rise while he is still feeding on her, and thus he will die. So Ellen does exactly that, and she dies. Essentially, she willingly sacrifices herself, but to pour salt into the wound. She survives just long enough for her husband Thomas to come home and see her final moments before she dies. In short, the Irish went romance. And Germans went 9, death. And yes, Bram Stoker is Irish. If you didn't already know that, now you do. A bit of added trivia for anyone interested. The name Nosferatu was already in Bram Stoker's book. In chapter 16, in one of Dr. Seward's diary entries, he writes, "Friend Arthur, if you had met that kiss which you know of before poor Lucy die, or again last night when you opened your arms to her, you would in time, when you had died, have become Nosferatu, as they call it in Eastern Europe, and would all time make more of those undeads that so have filled us with horror. The career of this so unhappy dear lady is but just begun." And again, not long after this, we read in chapter 18 in Mina Harker's journal, "Had I known at the first what now I know, nay, had I even guessed at him, one so precious life had been spared to many of us who did love her, but that is gone. And we must so work that other poor souls perish not, whilst we can save. The Nosferatu do not die like the bee when he sting once. He is only stronger, and being stronger, have yet more power to work evil. This vampire which is amongst us is of himself so strong in person as 20 men. And that passage continues into a lengthy description of Dracula's many abilities in that source material. As you can see, the term Nosferatu had already been integrated into the Dracula lore of the book before the German film proceeded to take that term and apply it to him as the titular name of the character. Why they thought a couple of name changes and a more twisted German ending would be sufficient enough to not be sued is beyond me. Now, ordering all copies of the film to be destroyed seems like an overcorrection, and in fact probably only helped to hype up the mystique of the film. It was basically the Streisand effect before she or the internet ever existed. If you'd like to watch the original Nosferatu, you can do so on YouTube. It's now in public domain and it has been restored. I will even link the version I personally watched just a few days before I watched Robert Eggers' version for the first time. I had heard beforehand that the original Nosferatu was categorized as German expressionism, so I found myself surprised that visually the film was not more abstract. When I use the word expressionism, I would expect to see more sets that are not designed to be realistic. But for much of the film's short runtime, I saw locations and sets that looked fairly realistic to what old-timey Germany would have presumably looked like. I don't mean this as an insult, but the original Nosferatu is not scary. As a matter of fact, I laughed out loud while watching it. Perhaps it was frightening for the time in which it was released, but to a contemporary audience of adults, I don't think there's much in it that strikes fear into the hearts of the audience. A lot of that has to do with how Nosferatu is performed. It's a lot of this. Original Nosferatu is acting like he's about to hang out with the girls and eat everyone up in a RuPaul's Drag Race acting challenge. The part of the film where Thomas's portrait of Ellen falls out and Nosferatu is looking at it with this long dramatic pause, and then he just goes, "A beautiful neck your wife has." Oh, that made me burst into laughter. Audible laughter. I was wholly unprepared for how funny he is. It's just a stylistic difference. In general, a lot of silent film acting comes across like overacting compared to much of what you would see in films nowadays. It's when film was a newer medium, so a lot of actors were coming from acting in theater where you would absolutely be expected to act in a more exaggerated manner because ultimately you are acting for the people in the back row. But it's still a really interesting watch to get more of an understanding of the historical origins of vampire storytelling, be it from the Dracula lore or just vampires in general. Also, if you're a fan of horror as a genre, I think it's good to watch to see how this film is formative to a lot of what exists in the genre today. To transition a bit into how Robert Eggers' film connects to this source material, broadly speaking, I found that the film embodied the more undiluted perspective of Dracula/Nosferatu, where he is a terrifying monster, a hungry predator, and how distressing it is for the humans he is preying on. Also, being that this Nosferatu is an adaptation of the film, it also has that ending, which I would not be surprised if there are some unaware viewers that will go and see the film and leave upset because of the fact that she dies. A misinformed reaction could be to lash out that the female lead of the story dies, but when you compare Robert Eggers' version to the original, you can see that there's been more of an effort to expand her story in such a way that makes her more than just a dainty wife who decided to sacrifice herself to Nosferatu. The first thing they establish in the film is that there is already this supernatural connection between Ellen and Nosferatu. And also, a quick thing I want to let everyone know if you haven't seen the film already. Ellen has a cat, and the cat does not die. The cat is okay. The cat fares much better in the film than Ellen does. I was very stressed out about the cat anytime I would see it. If they had done something bad to the cat for shock value, I probably would have deducted half a star on Letterboxd. I take cats very seriously. I have a cerebellar hypoplasia cat named Kimiko, and she is my baby. If you cannot make your monster scary without needlessly using a cat as shocking, gruesome, on-screen cannon fodder, then maybe you're not as skilled of a storyteller as you think you are. Robert Eggers has made it very clear that doing a Nosferatu film was a major passion project of his, and he was trying to make this for many years. For quite some time, Anya Taylor-Joy was attached to play Ellen, and there is no denying that I really would have loved to see her play that character, but his love for Nosferatu is evident in so many of the details. Even something like recreating the cross decorations on the beach in the new film to pay homage to what you see in the original. Details like those are especially appreciated because that is the type of thing that artists do. You lovingly thread in classic iconography purely for the love of the art itself. In general, there's also a very different caliber of filmmaking compared to the original because you have 100 years of technical advancements in every facet of the filmmaking process. From the quality of cameras, lights, steadicams, special effects makeup, and just in general, the shift in style of acting on camera all makes for a more unsettling, albeit grandiose, filmmaking experience than what you get from the original film. The scale and scope of everything is significantly amplified. Never mind the fact that you're allowed to present a vastly different level of violence and horrific imagery today than what film studios would have allowed you to do 100 years ago.
It's sort of a strange feeling to actually be excited to share the movie for real.
But now, of course, I want to talk about full spoilers. I want to first go through a couple of quick nitpicks that I have. I understand that the film is, in a way, a period piece, but it's also a completely fictional world in which vampires, or at the very least, one vampire is real, since unlike Dracula, Nosferatu does not have a set of brides in his castle, and the Nosferatu equivalent of Lucy, she doesn't get turned into a vampire. There were two other main nitpicks that I had. The first one, you might think I'm making a joke, but I'm being completely serious when I say that Nosferatu having a mustache lowered my overall viewing experience. Now, just as a reminder, in case you forgot, I still rated this film at 4.3 out of 5, so it's still one of the higher rated films I've logged from this year on my Letterboxd. But I will explain to you my issue with the mustache. There was a lot of buildup and mystique about this version of Nosferatu. They went out of their way to not reveal what he looks like in any of the film's promotional material. Whether it's the posters or the trailers, he was kept completely hidden. All we see is an ominous figure with his face hidden under a hood. And being that he's played by Bill Skarsgård, who has more than proven himself to be capable of transforming into otherworldly creatures, we as the audience have a lot of anticipation about this reveal. In the film, when Thomas goes to the castle and is led upstairs by Count Orlok, we still can't see what he looks like, but he's got this deep, unsettling voice, his movements are unnatural, he slips in and out of shadows, and like I said in the earlier part of this review, Robert Eggers did phenomenal shadow work, so when Count Orlok is going into the shadows, it almost feels like that's an extension of him and the threat that he poses. But when we finally get upstairs, and Thomas is told to sit down, settle in, eat some food, they eventually have Count Orlok sit down at the table with him, and you're finally able to get a look at his face, and the first thing that popped in my mind was, why is Dr. Robotnik in Robert Eggers' Nosferatu?
I might as well save it!
And from there, the more I would see the mustache, the more I would hate that they chose to give him one. Because I was thinking about the mustache and why the hell he has one, instead of just staying immersed in the story and the stakes of what's happening in the scenes he appears in. Yes, the mustache is that bad, so you now have to listen to me explain why I disagree with this choice.
I hate to break it to you, but I'm gonna.
Dracula, whether he's in the book or in some of the adaptations, such as the film Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, he can take on any number of forms. Part of the transformation that happens in the book is that when he's able to feed more, he starts to appear younger. We're not even going into all of the lore involving him shapeshifting into animals. In chapter 22, the characters hunting Dracula find one of his hideout lairs and come across some of his belongings. There were title deeds of the Piccadilly house in a great bundle. deeds of the purchase of the houses at Mile End and Bermondsey, notepaper, envelopes, and pens and ink. All were covered up in thin wrapping paper to keep them from the dust. There were also a clothes brush, a brush and comb, and a jug and basin, the latter containing dirty water which was reddened as if with blood. Dracula in the Coppola film, when he looks younger, you see Gary Oldman has facial hair. Him being younger or even being considered handsome is just part of his arsenal of predatory tactics to ensnare victims to feed on or possibly transform into vampires. But Count Orlok doesn't transform in that way. In the original version, he looks wide-eyed and cartoonish the entire time, and in Robert Eggers' version, he looks busted and festering the entire time. He's got this one bit of hair in the front that sort of flops to one side, and I can't tell if it reminds me more of a Key and Peele sketch or David Cross in Scary Movie 2, but the point is that this is not a man who is going to take time to groom himself. Why would he have a thick mustache that obviously would require some upkeep? You look like Dr. Robotnik, and now I'm spending precious airtime in this review going on and on about how distracted I was by a mustache when I should be going on and on about how spectacularly gothic and creepy the movie was. Now make no mistake, Bill's performance was excellent, but I was always more engaged by his work when I couldn't really see his face. Voice work, clawed hands, and don't even get me started on how diabolical and cursed that one part of the movie is where he's writhing naked on top of Nicholas Hoult, slurping loudly while feeding on him. Nicholas Hoult was also fine, but part of me can't help but feel as though I maybe would have liked to see Aaron David Beckham Johnson play his part, and it's not even because I had any issue with Nicholas Hoult's performance, but I simply found myself wanting to see more of Aaron's work than what he was given to do in this, since he only played a secondary character in the story. The part where he loses his entire family and he's just absolutely emotionally shattered and he's kicking off at the funeral. Oh, if there's one thing Aaron's going to do, it's eat up an emotional gut punch performance every time. Really think about this for a moment. Bullet Train when he thinks Lemon is dead. Craven the Hunter at the very end when he's confronting his father. And now, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu when his whole family's been murdered by Nosferatu. Okay, but picture it. Aaron in a rom-com doing a tearful romantic declaration to his love interest. The romance girlies are craving it.
You gagged.
Actually, a quick sidebar. Can someone explain to me why anytime I open TikTok, there is a new slang phrase making the rounds in the comments? Aaron is the reason I learned a brand new one that appears in every TikTok comment section of him doing promotion.
Can you shed some light on the current situation?
And to expand further on the murder of Aaron's family in Nosferatu, I need to reiterate how good Robert Eggers was at ramping up the horror of Nosferatu, because when they showed him feeding on Aaron's kids, let me just say this. The people who were throwing a temper tantrum at Terrifier 3 for its opening, all of which isn't even visible, it's just chopping and splattering sounds that you hear, but you see nothing. Meanwhile, Nosferatu is feeding on 2 children, and when he's caught, he just tosses them away like rag dolls. Do you think those people who were upset at Terrifier 3 are going to have anything to say about Nosferatu? Or were they just complaining because they were bored and they like to jump on whatever is the trendy thing to be upset about instead of forming their own opinions about works of art? My only other significant critique for the film, besides the mustache, is that anytime they did a close-up on Ellen and she was supposed to be conveying some sort of significant emotion, be it sadness, terror, or feeling supernaturally haunted, I was utterly unconvinced. There was a total lack of range in the emotional expressions. If you are acting and want to convince me that you are conveying a particular emotion, I need your face to move in such a way that convinces me of that. The bodywork was good though. Any sort of flailing or convulsing, being supernaturally overcome, that worked perfectly fine. I believed that. Willem Dafoe served every bit of unhinged Willem Dafoe energy you would want from him, not that anyone would expect otherwise. Ultimately, what I appreciate the most about how Robert Eggers approaches reimagining Nosferatu is that he brings back the monstrosity of the source material. Even though it's meant to be an adaptation of the 1922 film, that film wasn't all that gruesome. The book, however, is really dark and twisted, and in that regard, Robert Eggers was delivering a quintessential vampire story. Everything was so so artfully designed that it demands acknowledgement in ways that the horror genre doesn't receive as often as it should from people outside of the primary fan base of the genre. I cannot emphasize enough how immersive this world feels. Even just the details in the dilapidated castle, it feels like you could reach out and feel how ruined and run down chunks of the wall are. I also really like the writing because of how perfectly it references source material, but also puts its own spin on things. Like, as an example, when Nosferatu says, "I am an appetite," oh, that line is a banger, and it perfectly embodies what this version of the character is. There was no undercurrent of something more sympathetic for the audience to fixate on, something to make you empathize with him. No, he's just pure, all-consuming darkness. And early in the film, when Thomas gives Ellen flowers and she says the line about how he's killed the flowers, that's a line that you see in the original film, but the delivery and tone has been altered. Ellen's already activated in this new version and being haunted and stressed out by this monster, so you get the callback to the original, but you also immediately establish that this is reimagining the material for its own artistic journey. Across the board, Robert Eggers understands how to deliver a bold visual spectacle that has to be experienced on the big screen. There's horror, drama, gorgeous visuals, and even humor. There were a lot of people laughing out loud at my early screening. Usually it was at something Willem Dafoe said. Nosferatu might only be my second favorite Robert Eggers film, but nonetheless, he has delivered the goods, and we can only hope that this can pave the way for more respect for the horror genre outside of the core fan base, as well as more vampire movies on the big screen, because I love watching them. Let Robert Eggers tackle any classic story he's passionate about, because when you see what he did with The Northman and now with Nosferatu, he's now someone I think has earned the right to reimagine whatever literature or mythology he's interested in. The Northman was basically the source material for Hamlet, so any Shakespeare girlies, that movie is for you. Just add more action, sprinkle in some sort of magical supernatural flavoring, and make everything look immaculate and kind of violent, and you have Robert Eggers' The Northman. And now he's made his passion project, and the vampire girlies are positively devouring it.
That weird feeling makes me a little more vulnerable about it as well, but I hope people enjoy it.